Welcome to Hidden Front History. Today we're taking a deep dive into a corner of World War II history that you rarely hear about. It's a story without tactical maneuvers or bombing campaigns, but it's about something far more personal and, in the end, maybe even more destructive to the ideology it challenged. We're talking about the power of unexpected kindness.
Okay, let's unpack this. We've got a really powerful stack of sources' diaries, firsthand testimonies, historical records, and they detail the experience of 847 German women who were auxiliary personnel. They were captured and held as prisoners of war right here in the United States in 1945.
And our mission here isn't to just recount a battle. It's to understand a profound psychological crisis that these women went through. A crisis that was triggered not by cruelty, which is what they were braced for, but by dignity.
Exactly. That's the core contradiction we found in these sources, isn't it? A nation fiercely at war treating its enemies, in some ways, better than the enemy's own government had treated them in those final chaotic months.
Yeah.
We're really examining how mercy, when it's administered institutionally, can become this profound catalyst for internal conflict, for a total ideological collapse.
So let's set the scene, really establish the psychological starting point. It's March 1945. The war in Europe is it's collapsing violently. And these women, they were young, mostly late teens, early 20s. They'd served in the Signal Corps as nurses, administrative staff. They get swept up in the final chaos and shipped across the Atlantic.
And they arrived carrying an unbelievable burden of fear. I mean, they had been steeped in years of intense, terrifying propaganda. They were told exactly what to expect from the Americans, that they were rapacious, brutal, fundamentally uncivilized.
They were expecting the worst: stripping, public mockery, humiliation. For many, the ultimate terror was being forced into brothels or just being allowed to starve to death, while their captors paid lip service to some rules they didn't believe in. They had psychologically braced themselves for utter degradation.
Yeah, the sources describe their arrival so vividly, you can just picture it. 847 women stumbling off these transport trains in rural Georgia. They're starving, they're exhausted, wearing these loose, dirty, gray Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms that offer no real protection or, sense of order.
We really need to anchor this in a specific person to get the scale of it. The sources focus on a few, but especially one named Greta, a former radio operator from Hamburg. She was only 23 years old, but the records know she physically looked 40.
40. I mean, think about that. The stress, the malnutrition, the constant fear. It had aged her 2 decades in just a few years. Her hair was matted, her hands shook constantly from nerves and hunger, and she's carrying just a few possessions: a water-stained diary and a rosary.
And then there's Anna. She's presented as the hardened one, an anti-aircraft operator from Berlin who had learned to just shut down her emotions completely.
It was a survival mechanism, right, to get through the firebombing of her city. These were not soft women. They were survivors.
Absolutely. And their only remaining defense was this rigid control, this deep distrust and hatred of the enemy. And that deeply ingrained control was about to be challenged by, of all things, the sight of polished leather and clean uniforms.
Which brings us right into the first major shock. It wasn't a physical blow, it was cognitive dissonance. It started the second they stepped off that train. The first overwhelming reality was the guards themselves.
The sources make a huge point of this. The American guards looked pristine. Not necessarily hardened combat vets, but men and women who looked, and I'm quoting here, like they had just stepped out of a recruitment poster.
Starched uniforms, polished boots, and crucially, their demeanor was completely unexpected. They didn't shout, they didn't raise their weapons aggressively, there was no mocking, no jeering, and that quiet professionalism was, in itself, a kind of weapon. In the final months of the Reich, German military organization was dissolving into chaos. Officers were ragged, demoralized. So these American guards, they represented not just military superiority, but organizational stability, discipline, resources, things these women hadn't seen in months, maybe years.
And that stability was immediately compounded by the formality of what happened next. A translator steps forward. The sources describe him as this middle-aged man with a calm, gentle voice, and he says something that was just utterly foreign to their experience. You are prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. You will be treated accordingly.
Now, you have to understand, for these women, Geneva Convention was basically a meaningless phrase. It was propaganda. They were told it was a document the Allies just ignored. It was a lie.
A total fiction.
Yeah, and yet, here was the enemy. In the middle of a war, they were winning decisively, meticulously adhering to this codified set of humanitarian rules. It signaled structure, order, accountability, the very things that had vanished from their own society.
They were being told through action that their lives, even as enemies, still had some kind of inherent value, and the processing that followed just deepened this confusion, this creeping sense of unease. They were led into these large, newly built wooden buildings.
And the smell. They smelled of fresh timber and disinfectant. They were expecting a military police interrogation unit, harsh lighting, immediate demands for information.
But what they found was a setting designed for repair, not for extraction. The presence of real nurses, American women, with kind, if busy, eyes moving around stations with clipboards and medical supplies. That was the second major shock.
Greta had been braced for threats, for demands about military intelligence. Instead, she got bureaucracy.
Paperwork. The sheer, dull normalcy of the process was itself a huge surprise. They were asked routine questions: name, age, unit, medical history. In their world, if you were captured, you were immediately valuable for information or labor. Here, they were just being registered. They were a number on a clipboard, but that number guaranteed their existence and their status.
And then came the medical examination. This is where that primal fear, the one fueled by all that propaganda, just spiked again. They knew what physical examinations could mean in environments without oversight. They watched women disappear behind canvas screens, and they were just anticipating the worst degradation.
But the deliberate, consistent dignity continued. The doctor was a woman, which immediately lessened some of the tension, and she gave Greta what the sources call a tired professional smile. It was a smile focused on survival and health, not on judgment or malice.
Right. The procedure was about identifying their immediate health needs, helping them survive starvation and disease. It wasn't about humiliation. When the translator said, "Please remove your uniform," Greta felt completely exposed in her threadbare undergarments. She'd had no privacy for months. She was waiting for the sneer, the mockery.
But the doctor just made notes on her chart, checked her heart, her lungs, documenting physical trauma, not inflicting it. And then the third great shock arrived. Something so simple, yet so ideologically devastating.
She was handed a clean, folded towel and given a simple instruction, pointing toward another door, delousing and bathing. Everyone must be clean before being assigned to barracks.
And this simple command is what leads us right into the heart of this deep dive. The profound, transformative experience of what the sources call the weapon of hot water and soap.
You have to put yourself in their shoes.
Okay.
Understand the context of that single word, delousing. In 1945, that word, coupled with a command to bathe, immediately triggered absolute visceral terror. Greta and the other women, they recalled the horrific whispers in the East. The propaganda, yes, but also the sickening reality of the camps. The idea of dousing showers that were not showers at all. She braced herself. This was it. This was the moment the American veneer of kindness would vanish.
This is when they would reveal their true nature, as she wrote, the ultimate moment of cognitive dissonance. They entered the room, and the sources say they moved like they were walking to their execution. But the scene was again completely, jarringly different. A large room, white tiled walls, wooden benches, and crucially, real shower stalls, complete with curtains for privacy.
Privacy. A concept of self-respect that had been entirely absent from their lives for years. And the objects sitting on the bench were impossibly shocking yet so simple. A clean, rough cotton towel, and a bar of white rectangular soap that smelled faintly of flowers.
Think about that sensory detail for a second. This wasn't the harsh caustic lye soap they were used to, which smelled like industrial chemicals. This was real, high-quality American soap. It smelled of normalcy, of childhood, of a cleanliness that wasn't enforced by fear.
And the American personnel in the room were just detached, professional. They weren't watching for sport. The translator simply explained the rules. Use the soap, 20 minutes maximum, the water is hot. Clean yourselves thoroughly for your own health, and leave your old, contaminated clothes in the bins provided.
The sources describe this profound, agonizing silence. 30 seconds, maybe a minute. They just stood there, waiting for the trap to spring, waiting for the mockery. Why would the enemy provide such a thing, such a luxury?
And then Anna, the one who had built that emotional fortress around herself, she broke the silence. She stepped forward, grabbed the soap, and walked into a stall.
The sound of the water starting was described by Greta as being like a gunshot in the silence. When Greta finally walked into her own stall and she tentatively turned the handle, expecting cold, weak water, she just gasped. It was genuinely consistently hot water, steaming beautifully in the cool air. It wasn't a trickle. It was a deluge.
A deluge that washed away months of grime. The feeling of lice, the fear, the sheer bone-deep exhaustion. That physical sensation was just an overwhelming sensory experience. Greta started crying immediately. Soft, exhausted tears mixing with the water and the easy floral lather of the soap.
It was a profound, visceral feeling of restored humanity. In that moment, she wasn't a rat scrambling in the ruins anymore. She was a clean person, afforded a moment of peace.
And the emotional fallout just rippled through the room. Some women were laughing softly in disbelief. The sheer absurdity of it all was overwhelming. Others, like Greta, were just weeping uncontrollably. But Anna's reaction, her reaction is the one that really encapsulates the ideological crisis.
Yeah, Anna, the hardened anti-aircraft operator, she whispered through the curtain, her voice thick with emotion. It's not fair. It's not fair that they have this and we have nothing.
And that fury, that intense sense of injustice, that is the sound of an entire ideological system collapsing in real time. Hatred requires your enemy to be a simplistic, monolithic evil, defined by cruelty. When that enemy provides you with a simple human necessity like hot water, it just shatters the framework of that hatred.
It forces the question, right? If the enemy is so rich and so organized that they can afford to treat their prisoners with this level of dignity, what does that say about the leadership we followed? It makes the entire war effort questionable on a fundamentally personal, moral level.
So stepping out of that shower clean, pink-skinned, physically lighter, that was the real turning point. They walked toward the mess hall feeling psychologically heavier, trying to process this unbearable contradiction. They expected degradation, and they received consistent, meticulous dignity.
And that profound contradiction just intensified when they reached the mess hall, which leads us into what the sources call the crisis of abundance.
The smell of the mess hall was the next assault on their senses. Not the stench of unwashed bodies or harsh chemicals, but the unmistakable, rich aroma of frying bacon.
Real bacon. Not the ersatz, watery meat substitute they've been subsisting on for years. They entered this long, sunlit wooden building. American soldiers were eating their own meals at nearby tables, paying little attention to them.
And the sources emphasize there was no segregation. Everyone was eating the same abundant food, another small but powerful signal of institutional parity.
And then Greta's tray. It's described in such detail you can almost taste it. Scrambled eggs, crisp bacon, thick toast slathered with butter, a steaming cup of coffee, oatmeal, and a fresh orange.
The source material calculates this was not only more food than she had seen in a single meal in 2 years, but it was possibly more nutritional value than her entire family had consumed in a week back home.
And here is the core psychological paralysis that followed. They reached the tables with their loaded trays, but no one ate. Not immediately. They just sat there, staring at the steaming food, the eggs, the melting butter, for 30 seconds, a full minute, as if the food itself was a weapon about to detonate.
The spell was finally broken by a young woman from Munich, maybe 19 years old. She tentatively took a bite of the eggs. Her eyes immediately widened and she began to cry. Silently. Just tears of pure shock.
The eggs were fluffy, seasoned with salt and pepper, real ingredients. The bacon was rich and smoky. The butter melted instantly into the toast.
That physical sensation of being truly full, of tasting richness and seasoning after months of chronic starvation, it just collided violently with their consciousness. Anna, still resistant, ate mechanically, whispering, "This is wrong. They shouldn't be feeding us like this."
This consistent, simple kindness was systematically dismantling the very foundation of their ideological commitment, that the enemy was evil and deserved nothing but destruction.
And this sense of normalcy just kept going. Back in the barracks, it wasn't anything fancy, just simple, newly built wooden structures. But they had real beds. Not straw pallets on the floor, real beds with sheets, blankets, and pillows. Each woman got a small wooden locker for personal items, which allowed Greta to safely store her now precious diary.
The attention to basic human comfort was meticulous and deliberate. There was a pot-bellied stove already stacked with pre-cut wood, and extra blankets were provided for the cold Georgia nights. The American military was treating their comfort as a logistical necessity, as something that mattered. That was profoundly unsettling for them.
And then there was the canteen. Greta described it as a space stocked with impossibly luxurious items. Hershey bars, cigarettes, toothpaste, combs. Things that had vanished from Germany years ago were just being sold freely in a POW camp.
They were even paid in camp script for light duties, so they could purchase these symbols of American prosperity. Think about Greta saving her script for a week just to buy one single Hershey bar.
That moment of consumption must have been revelatory. Holding the brown paper and silver foil, reading the English words she couldn't understand, and then biting into the chocolate. Sweet, creamy, perfect. The taste didn't just nourish her. It triggered deep, buried sensory connections to a lost, innocent past, to childhood Christmases before the war.
The enemy was literally restoring sensory connections to a world their own government had completely destroyed.
Physically, the recovery was astonishingly quick. You could see it. The women rapidly regained weight, their skin cleared up, their hair regained its shine. They looked alert, strong, alive again.
But this is where the mental collapse began in earnest. Every improvement, every healthy meal, every bar of soap, every comfortable night's sleep, it just increased this unbearable, compounding weight of guilt and confusion.
They were recovering physically, returning to a state of health they hadn't known in years, but their minds were struggling fiercely to process why. Why did they deserve this privilege when their own people were still suffering so terribly?
And that profound suffering back home was confirmed in late March, when letters started to arrive through the Red Cross. And this leads us into the deepest, most painful segment of the sources, the crucible of guilt.
These letters were just devastating. They were slow, often unreliable, but they carried undeniable, brutal news from home, delivered right into the comfort of their clean barracks.
Greta's letter confirmed her worst fears with agonizing precision. Hamburg was rubble. Her mother wrote that the family was living in a cellar, cold and damp, and they were surviving on soup made primarily from potato peels.
Potato peels. And her brother was missing, presumed dead. She read the letter, folded it carefully, and then sat staring at her dinner tray in the mess hall. It was pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans. She said she felt physically ill, just unable to reconcile the two realities.
The juxtaposition is shattering, and it was inescapable, wasn't it? The women were eating pot roast, a product of this overwhelming American abundance, while their families were eating potato peel soup, a desperate symbol of collapse and starvation.
Anna's news was even worse. Her parents were dead in an air raid, her sister in a refugee camp. Anna's reaction was to burn the letter in the pot-bellied stove, a final, futile attempt to destroy the unbearable truth. But of course, the image of her ruined family remained.
And this shared devastation led to a grim, but I think necessary ritual in the camp. Women began gathering outside, reading their letters aloud, sharing what Greta called the burden of guilt. They had beds, heat, 3 meals a day. Their families had rubble, hunger, despair. This was the ultimate betrayal of self.
And this is the absolute crux of the source's analysis. This is the moment we have to pause and reflect on. It was not cruelty that broke these women, but kindness. Mercy became unbearable, precisely because it forced them to recognize their own relative privilege, a privilege provided by the enemy.
Yeah, their suffering in the camp, which would have justified their hatred, it was replaced by a comfort that demanded self-reflection and this absolute ideological guilt.
But the cognitive dissonance peaked when some of the women were allowed out on work details outside the camp. It allowed them to see the untouched American world for the first time. The contrast was just physically overwhelming.
They rode in open trucks through rural Georgia. They saw painted houses with manicured lawns. They saw children playing loudly in the streets. And most critically, they saw no bomb craters. None. Everything was intact, normal, functioning perfectly.
The contrast with the moonscape of ruins they had left behind was literally incomprehensible. Their minds were conditioned to universal destruction.
Greta specifically recalled seeing a small-town grocery store. Not empty shelves covered by ration signs, but shelves fully stocked with cans, bags of flour stacked high, fresh produce, meats. Abundance was just spilling into the aisles. And then, the single, simple luxury that cemented the realization, a young boy casually walked out of the store eating an ice cream cone. An ice cream cone, a dessert that hadn't been seen in Germany, even on the black market, since 1942.
That is the moment of bitter, crushing truth. Anna, sitting beside Greta in the truck, didn't say anything about soldiers or tanks. She just said, this is what we were fighting. Not soldiers, not armies, this. And she was gesturing to the town, the casual wealth, the staggering normalcy of daily life.
And this forces us to ask a really uncomfortable question. Was this structural stability and abundance a form of psychological warfare? The sources suggest the women concluded, quite rightly, that we never stood a chance against this.
Right. They weren't fighting mere soldiers or a temporary military force. They were fighting an economic and social structure of such overwhelming resource and stability that the war barely touched its daily civilian life. That realization, the sheer scale of the task they were set against, that was the true ideological defeat.
It was an epiphany. Their sacrifice, their years of believing in this necessary struggle against a supposedly impoverished, desperate enemy was instantly revealed as a catastrophic delusion. They were fighting an enemy that had so much capacity, so much surplus, that they could afford to be kind.
And that profound realization of American strength sets the stage for the final major transformation we see documented in the women's accounts.
That structural revelation was then compounded by individual experiences of humanity. This brings us to kindness as the ultimate weapon. The women were forced to confront these small individual acts of humanity they witnessed, which further complicated their rigid view of the evil enemy.
We have to slow down and appreciate the weight of these small, unsanctioned acts. Take the example of Sarah, a young woman guard from Tennessee. She had a gentle, soft accent, and she often tried to bridge the language barrier. She saw Greta writing in her diary one afternoon.
And Sarah approached her not with a command, but with a carefully folded piece of paper. Inside was a simple, non-threatening drawing of a flower, and the English words, painstakingly written, "You are brave."
Just think about that. A completely personal, unauthorized gesture from one young woman to another, transcending the barbed wire and the uniforms. Greta noted in her diary, "I am a prisoner. I am a failure. How can I be brave?" But that simple, direct recognition of her humanity, that she was being treated with dignity by someone who had every reason to view her as an object of hatred, it just overwhelmed her. The sources say she cried for the first time since her arrival, precisely because she was forced to feel seen, not judged.
And then there was Lieutenant Cooper, an older guard, been wounded in the Pacific and moved to stateside duty. He'd play American folk songs on his guitar in the evening. But he didn't just play for them. He asked the German women to sing their own songs about home, family, loss.
This bridging of the divide through shared music melodies of homesickness and loss are universal, right? It just chipped away at the final walls of hatred. Every small act, a nurse taking extra time to adjust a bandage or a cook slipping extra fruit onto a tray, it forced the women to reconcile their ingrained ideological belief with the reality that they were being treated as fellow human beings.
The ideological crisis hit its peak after the surrender in May. The news arrived in the camps, signaling the ultimate defeat. But the women's reaction wasn't relief, it was despair. If the Reich was utterly defeated and the enemy was demonstrably kind, what precisely had all the suffering been for? Every sacrifice was rendered meaningless.
The late-night barracks talks became raw, critical, completely unfiltered discussions. They moved from personal guilt to a profound political analysis. Women began confronting the lies they were told. The enemy was evil, but look how they treat us. Look how they treat everyone.
They noticed things. The lack of segregation in the American ranks. Black soldiers eating at the same tables as white soldiers, women serving as guards and nurses.
And they concluded, as a group, that the American adherence to strict, formalized rules, the Geneva Convention, the internal parity they witnessed, this wasn't a weakness. This was the very definition of civilization. The pain of that realization was immense because it meant their own society, the one they had sacrificed everything for, was fundamentally less civilized.
Greta's diary entry just captures the intellectual and moral devastation perfectly. She wrote, "If the enemy values our lives, why do we not? Why did our own government treat us as expendable while the Americans treat us as human?"
They were forced to face the stark reality that the Reich had failed them, not just militarily and economically, but morally. It had treated its own citizens with less humanity than its sworn enemy did.
And the American response wasn't limited to just physical care, it was also intellectual engagement. They offered voluntary educational programs, English classes, lectures on American government, discussions on democracy. This wasn't indoctrination. It was an explanation of the system that had just provided them with hot water and chocolate.
And the women flocked to these programs out of genuine curiosity. They wanted to understand the people who had conquered them. The sources highlight a Mrs. Patterson, the volunteer teacher, a civilian woman with a strong Southern accent. She had sons serving in Europe, and she was naturally worried about them. Yet she treated the German women with immense, patient respect.
When Greta, who was struggling with English, asked her directly, "Why are you kind, we enemy?" Mrs. Patterson's simple reply became, in a way, an organizational philosophy. She said, "You're not my enemy, dear. You're just a girl far from home. We're all God's children, no matter which side we were on."
And that statement of universal unearned humanity just broke Greta. She cried again. Unable to process receiving such genuine Christian charity and moral clarity from the enemy, the supposed barbarians, than she had experienced within her own supposedly superior Christian nation.
And then the film Nice just added to this perspective. Watching American comedies and musicals that showcased a world of effortless abundance, opportunity, freedom, the source material draws a profound conclusion here. And quote, "The most dangerous weapon was not bombs or bullets, it was dignity, it was mercy."
It was showing them, by treating them as human, an alternative way of life. A functioning society built on respect and surplus. Captivity in America had revealed more crushing truth than freedom in the Reich ever had.
The ultimate physical embodiment of this psychological change came in the summer. Greta was in the laundry barracks one afternoon, and she caught sight of her reflection in a large, clean metal surface.
She just stopped, staring. Her face was full and healthy again. Her skin was clear, her hair was shiny. She looked like the young woman she was before the war destroyed everything. The enemy, through consistent care, had restored her physical humanity.
Anna found her there, and their discussion was quiet but final. Anna confessed, and this is a profound shift in her perspective. I used to think strength meant being hard, being able to withstand anything. But maybe real strength is being kind when you have every reason not to be.
They'd crossed an irreversible line. They could never go back to believing the lies because they had witnessed the operational truth of the enemy's consistent humanity. They had been forced to recognize their own complicity in a destructive system by seeing the definition of humanity restored in their own reflection. The transformation was necessary, though agonizingly painful.
As we look toward the final phase of their internment, we encounter the final great irony of this entire story, the dread of repatriation.
In August 1945, when rumors circulated that they would soon be sent home, they should have been overjoyed. Instead, many felt an overwhelming dread. They were afraid to leave the security, the food, the basic dignity of the camp. Going home meant returning to chaos, starvation, and guilt.
The sources describe it as a shameful, almost treasonous feeling, but it was absolutely true. They knew returning to Germany meant returning to a nation that was physically destroyed and morally bankrupt. A nation that was not ready to hear the truth they now carried, the truth about American kindness.
Greta's final day in the camp illustrates this perfectly. She took one last long hot shower, carefully savoring the floral scent of the soap. She felt acutely that she was leaving a sanctuary, an unexpected place of security and abundance.
When she finally reached Hamburg in late October 1945, the city was a moonscape of ruins. Her family was thin, exhausted, still living in the cellar, subsisting on the bare minimum.
The conflict was immediate and visible. Her mother looked at her daughter, noting the fullness of her face, the health in her skin, and she remarked, "You look so healthy," mixing palpable wonder with confusion and, inevitably, a touch of subconscious resentment. Greta was carrying the visible, undeniable proof of her comfortable captivity.
Her father's reaction, however, provided the final, quiet summation of the entire experience. After listening to Greta's halting account of being treated humanely, of the soap and the food and the kind nurses, he said quietly, "They were better to you than we were to ourselves. That's something we will have to live with."
And that is the enduring lesson captured across all the sources. Years later, Greta reflected on this experience repeatedly. The ultimate function of the soap and hot water wasn't just utilitarian. They became profound symbols of survival and undeniable proof that humanity can prevail, restoring not just their bodies, but their souls.
She concluded that the true measure of a nation's moral fiber is not how it treats its friends, or even its neutral observers, but how it treats its enemies. Mercy, she realized, was far harder to carry than hatred. Cruelty is simple, it requires no thought. But consistent kindness forces you to question everything, including yourself.
So the story of these 847 German women POWs, it really demonstrates the overwhelming power of dignity as a force for ideological destruction and personal transformation. It shows that the most effective challenge to a tyrannical system might not be military force alone, but simple, consistent, overwhelming adherence to the highest standards of humanity.
So what does this all mean for us today? When you encounter information that directly contradicts your deepest held assumptions, that moment of searing cognitive dissonance like Greta staring at the hot water and the bacon, that's where true, painful, and lasting learning begins. It's the moment your worldview is forced to expand.
And if we connect this structural detail to the bigger picture, these women came to realize that the American adherence to rules and organizational stability, the fact that the Geneva Convention was followed, that all soldiers ate together, that this was the foundation of civilization. And it forces us to ask ourselves, in times of intense conflict, how consistently do we apply our own stated values to those who deserve it least, to those we have every justifiable reason to hate?
Is that not the true test of a society's strength? It is terrifyingly easy to cling to hatred and embrace cruelty in times of fear. It's far harder and ultimately far more destructive to an enemy's ideology to embrace and enforce consistent kindness. We invite you to reflect on that question. What would it take for the simplest act of mercy to become the most profound threat to your worldview? We'll catch you on the next deep dive.